Okay, chapter 26, part 3. I'm on page 1321. Uh, PPE ensembles, classification, and selections. Okay, to achieve adequate protection, ensemble is typically used consisting of respiratory equipment and clothing. When determining appropriate ensemble, consideration is given to definitely the hazards that are present, and the action that needs to be performed. The EPA has established a set of chemical protected PPE ensembles providing certain protection levels, commonly used by fire and emergency service organizations. So know that the EPA has set those standards for that chemical protective ensembles that we use. Okay, the EPA protection levels of protection that we're going to need to know is a level A, B, C, and D. Now, we kind of went over a little bit. I gave you some descriptions of the level A, B, and C earlier, but we're going to add D. So we're going to kind of go through this very quickly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because I kind of explained a good bit of it earlier. Level A. Level A. Need to know vapor protection, highest level of protection for respiratory tract, eyes, and skin. And that's against vapors, gases, mist, particles. Vapor protection is kind of where we understand level A, highest level of protection. Very little protection against fire. Operations level responders do not typically operate in situations requiring a level A. You must be appropriately trained to wear a level A PPE if you are required to wear it. Now, what this is going to consist of, the ensemble itself, fully encapsulating, just like we went over earlier, so you kind of just read that again, with the SCBA, full face piece, boots, over gloves, those sort of things. I'm not going to read because we kind of went over it earlier. Protection of eye, again, highest level, used when risk analysis indicates that it's appropriate. Level B, splash suits. A splash suit with an SCBA. Splash suit with SCBA. Some are fully encapsulating and the other type is non-encapsulating. So you have a fully encapsulated where you can't see the SCBA on your back. It's actually kind of looks like a vapor protective suit. And then you have a level B that's actually non-encapsulating where you can see the air pack on your back. But the key to this, a level B, is a SCBA. You will have an SCBA on. So it requires a garment, and it is splash protective. Level B, splash. Level A, vapor. Level B requires a garment, includes a SCBA or supplied air respirator, provides protection against splash from a hazardous material. It's worn when the highest level of respiratory protection is necessary, but a lesser level of skin protection is needed. Provides very little protection against fire, and again may be encapsulating or non-encapsulating. A place that you would probably see a level B. I gave you an example, a rule of thumb, that if you have responders and they're making entry into the hot zone and they're wearing a level A, if we have a formal technical decon set up, then the rule of thumb is we are one level less than who's going in the hot zone. So you're wearing a level A in the hot zone, decon might be at wearing a level B. So definitely might be something that you would find in a decon or a biological incident. One of the two. SCBA, already mentioned that, with non-encapsulating or encapsulating. Let's go to level C. A level C is different from a level B in the area equipment needed for respiratory protection. Respiratory protection. This is where you can wear an APR. Now, as I mentioned earlier, If you're going to wear an APR, an air purifying respirator, you must know the chemical that you're dealing with, and you must have continuous air monitoring at all times. So you must know that I'm able to wear this. I do not need an SCBA before I can actually start putting this on. So you'd have to basically identify and verify the chemical that you're working with. Composed of a splash protective garment with an APR or a powered APR, either or. Very little protection against fire, but the key thing here, periodic monitoring, I'm going to say constant monitoring at all times, air monitoring. You must know the material that's involved, and the material has been measured, those sort of things. The product is known, and you cannot be in an environment that we would consider oxygen deficient or oxygen enriched. So level C splash suit APR. Let's go to a level D. A level D. Level D is a work uniform, street clothes, overalls, street clothes, uniform. Can only be worn when there is no atmospheric hazards that exist. So level D, your work uniform. I'm going to add one more that's not in here. And this is, write this down, the U.S. military. The U.S. military. What they use, and this is called a mission-oriented protective posture. Mission-oriented protective posture, also known as a MOPP suit, M-O-P-P, MOPP suit. And these are used for chemical, biological, and radiological hazards. Chemical, biological, and radiological hazards. Write that down. MOPP suits. PPE selection factors, page 1325. Selection factors. Risk and potential hazards present at an incident will determine the PPE that's needed. Many available sources can be consulted to determine which type and what level of PPE to use at a hazmat incident, terrorist attack, depending on the circumstances and hazards at the scene. Operations level responders must operate under the guidance of allied professionals, hazmat technicians, and emergency response plan, and your SOPs. Once an incident action plan is developed, the site safety plan will spell out the PPE requirements. In general, know this, in general, the higher the level of PPE, the greater the associated risk. The greater the risk would require a higher level PPE. For any given situation, personnel should select equipment, clothing that provide an adequate level of protection. Overprotection as well as underprotection can be hazardous and should be avoided. Determine the PPE level needed to enter the hot zone is ultimately the IC's responsibility. Now, it is the IC's responsibility whenever you're on scene. They've got to take responsibility for pretty much the entire incident. But there will be a hazmat group. If you're the incident commander, you can have your hazmat team, and that hazmat team may have way more knowledge than you have. So even though you're overall responsible, you are relying on that hazmat group, that officer, to help you out with what sort of a chemical equipment that's going to be needed for that specific chemical. General selection factors are going to include chemical and physical hazards and must be considered and prioritized. Know this, monitoring and detection readings can identify hazards that need to be addressed in PPE selection. Is it possible that you would start off in a level A until you got all your air monitoring done? And then you can say, you know what, we can downgrade. So we do have what's called recon teams. Recon teams can go out, basically kind of identify what we're dealing with and come back. Maybe they've got the air monitoring with us. They set up the control zones. This is where we've got a ping on something. So now I'm going to set a flag or a cone or something. This is the control. This is the hot zone. Anything beyond that's hot zone. So now we set up our decon right on the edge of this, and now we can set up our cold zone. And then we can identify, maybe they need to go get a sample. And with that sample, now we can identify and verify that this is what we're dealing with. So just know that if unknown, if it's an unknown chemical, we're the highest level with the best chemical resistance. Highest level, best chemical resistance if you have an unknown. Exposure duration. Exposure duration, components, protective qualities may be limited by many factors, and that can be the exposure level, the material, the chemical resistance, and the air supply. Always assume the worst case exposure so that appropriate safety margins can be added to the ensemble's wear times. Then you have available protective clothing or equipment. Compliance with regulations. Agencies responsible for responding to chemical, biological, radiological incidents should select equipment in accordance to those standards. Protective clothing selection factors, the design. That's going to be, there's a variety of styles and configurations. The material chemical resistance. Choose a material that must resist a chemical, and that's going to be permeation, penetration, degradation. One permeating chemical may pull another with it through the material, so a mixture of chemicals can significantly be more aggressive towards protective material than a single chemical alone. So if it is a mix of chemicals, that might be a different case. Physical properties. Clothing material may offer wide ranges of physical qualities, such as strength, resistance to physical hazards, and operations in extreme environments. Users may need to ask the manufacturers, does the material have significant strength to withstand physical demands? Will the material resist tears, punctures, cuts? Will the material withstand repeated use after contamination or decontamination? There's some departments that decontaminate their equipment and they reuse it. Other departments throw it away. Just, depends on what department you're in, how much money you have, those sort of things come into play. Ease of decontamination, that is the degree of difficulty in decontaminating protective clothing, may dictate whether disposable clothing, reusable clothing, or a combination of both. Typical ensembles of response personnel. Ensembles worn at an incident may vary depending on the mission of the responder. Responders of any discipline must be aware of hazards present, PPE necessary to protect against hazards and to which they may be exposed, and the personnel who may need to use specific PPE must be trained to do so. Fire service personnel will wear ensembles appropriate for their mission at the incident. Moving on to heat-related stresses. Heat-related stresses. Okay. Let's know this, PPE-related stresses. We need to know, most PPE inhibits the body's ability to disperse heat and moisture. Know that. This is magnified because you're usually performing strenuous work while wearing PPE. While wearing the PPE it will increase risk of heat-related disorders. You need to know that. When working in cold environments, you may suffer cold-related disorders. Chemical protective clothing is not designed to provide insulation against the cold. Preventative measures will also help protect you from potential problems. Now, for the heat problem, there are those cool vests. You can wear a cool vest, and it's just the vest that goes around your core, and that definitely helps if you have those. So let's get into heat emergencies. Wearing PPE or other special full-body protective clothing puts you at considerable risk for developing health effects ranging from transient heat fatigue, or serious illness, or even death. Heat disorders, they're going to include heat stroke. So what we want to know about heat stroke is this is the most serious. Heat stroke, the most serious. I'll give you an example. You can write this down. Hot, dry skin. Why hot, dry skin? Because you quit sweating. And whenever your body has been able, that's how your body cools itself, by sweating. So if you're at the point where you have now stopped sweating, you may be at heat stroke, which is the most serious. Temperatures 105. So you're definitely in trouble. Heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion. Here you would still maybe have cool, moist skin. Cool, moist skin. And then heat cramps. Heat cramps is also part of heat stress. That could be the cramps in the legs, arms, abdomen, any of those. And then, of course, heat rashes may just be, just from walking, rubbing, chafing, those sort of things, heat rashes, or you could develop a little rash. But anyway, the worst one's heat stroke, heat exhaustion, of course, then you got heat cramps. Heat exposure prevention. Responders wearing protective clothing need to be monitored for the effects of heat exposure. That's why we do medical surveillance. Methods to prevent or reduce the effect of heat exposure. Know this. Fluid consumption. Fluid consumption. Use water or a commercial body fluid replenishment drinks to prevent dehydration. Drink generous amounts of fluids before and during the operations. Here's one right here. Drink 7 ounces of fluid. 7 ounces of fluid every 15 to 20 minutes is better than drinking large quantities of water once an hour. So 7 ounces of fluid every 15-20 minutes is better than drinking a large quantity of water or energy drink. Not an energy drink, but like Gatorade, something of that nature. They say you're supposed to mix it. Mix water and Gatorade. Air cooling. To provide natural body ventilation, the wear long cotton undergarments, moisture wicking modern fabrics or similar clothing. Ice cooling. Use ice to cool the body. Care must be taken. If you're using ice, know this, care must be taken not to damage the skin with direct contact of the ice. So you can wrap it in a towel, something of that nature, then put the ice on you. Do not cool off somebody too quickly. Do not cool them off too quickly. Water cooling, using water to cool the body. When the water, even sweat, evaporates, it cools the skin. So you might have a mobile shower. Cooling vest. You can wear a cooling vest beneath the PPE. You got rehab areas. You should have rehab areas. Provide shade, air conditioning units, those sort of things, water, all that stuff. And here's a big one, work rotation. Rotate your responders from exposed to extreme temperatures. So make sure you're doing work rotations. And this one right here, this is a big one. I'm kind of guilty, not of the alcohol, but I'm definitely guilty of the coffee. Before working, avoid to minimize the intakes of alcohol, coffee, and caffeinated drinks. Now, the alcohol, you shouldn't be doing that at work anyway. But coffee, I'm guilty. And caffeinated drinks. Now, what I do is I have a 64-ounce jug at work. I fill that up first thing in the morning, and I'm drinking that. I'm drinking water, 1 glass, and then the next glass I've got a little thing of Gatorade. I'll put a little powdered Gatorade in there. So I'm kind of mixing it throughout the day. Those drinks, alcohol, coffee, caffeinated drinks, will actually dehydrate you. Okay? Physical fitness. Encourage responders to maintain good physical fitness. Cold emergencies. Cold temperatures may be caused by weather and/or conditions such as exposures to cryogenic liquids. Prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures can result in serious health problems. Primary environmental conditions that cause code-related stress: low temperatures, high cool winds, dampness, cold water. Standing, walking, working on cold, snowy, or icy surfaces. Don't worry about that in Corpus too much. Maybe once in a blue moon. I think it's snowed twice since I've lived here in 20-something years. Wind chill, a combination of temperature and velocity, crucial factor to evaluate when working outside. All right. Rapid heat loss may occur when exposed to high winds, and know some of these. These are some things you need to know. Precautions to prevent cold disorders. Be active. Rehab in a warm area. Wearing warm clothing, layers of clothing. Dress appropriately and avoid cold beverages. So make sure you look over those precautions to cold disorders. Psychological issues. Chemical protected clothing can be a confining experience. Chemical protected clothing will be much more confining than structural firefighting clothing. That may cause claustrophobia. Knowing hazards of the chemicals involved may be disconcerting to the responder. Psychological issues may be preventable through adequate training. I think you guys have known just from your structural firefighting that you did to some of the rescue operations, your ladder bails, your rappelling and those sort of things, that once you get comfortable with your equipment, you are more comfortable, and maybe these are some things that won't bother you as much because you understand that the equipment's there to protect you. And also, the more training you do in it, the more you kind of get used to wearing it. And just takes time. I know everybody has their physical or psychological issues. Sometimes people get a little anxiety, those sort of things, but training kind of helps with that. Kind of acclimate to wearing whatever clothing you might be having to wear. So make sure you look over those psychological issues. Medical monitoring should be conducted as directed by the authority having jurisdiction. Here's something I mentioned earlier. Pre-entry monitoring. Know this, a pre-entry monitoring. This is before responders wearing PPE enter the warm or hot zones. So you must have a pre-entry monitoring before the responders enter the hot or warm zones. And again, that's what sets the baseline. They're even going to let you make entry. Post-entry monitoring after leaving. So know that there is a pre-entry and a post-entry. Some of the things they're going to check: vital signs, hydration, skin, mental status, and your medical history. Each organization needs to establish written medical monitoring guidelines. Written medical monitoring guidelines. And just know that a post-medical monitoring follow-up is recommended. We already said you have a post-entry monitoring, but after all that, a post-medical monitoring. Maybe they're drawing your blood. Now, when I was in hazmat, we had to go once a year for medical monitoring. And we would do hearing tests, blood tests, all that. So it was a full physical that we would have to do once a year. So post-medical monitoring. Exposure records should be kept on those employees. This is a legal requirement to retain medical records as per authority having jurisdiction. The exposure report should include type of exposure, length of exposure, description of the PPE used, the type of decontamination that was used, and an on-scene follow-up medical attention or assistance. Let's see. Okay. We're going to stop again at PPE use. We're about 24 minutes in. Again, I was going to make these a little bit shorter. Actually, the reason why it's easier and faster to upload these things. So anyway, We'll get back to PPE use when we come back.